Hi, it's Dr. Warden with Hopkins Family Med and Urgent Care, and today we are going to be talking about carbohydrates, and we'll be getting into the carbohydrate section of our nutrition series. Thank you. Hi, it's Dr. Warden, and we're back, and we're going to be talking about the carbohydrate section in our nutritional series. We're going to get into carbohydrates. So, carbohydrate is one of the macronutrients, and just like protein and just like fats, it is a macronutrient. It is one of the macronutrients, if not the majority of our calories comes from. It provides quick energy, and it's basically the main source of energy in which the brain uses. I mean, the brain can always use fat breakdown in the form of ketones, but during starvation, but the main source of energy comes from carbohydrates for the brain. The brain uses about 20% of our calories. So carbohydrates is broken down into simple sugars and complex. So mono and di versus polysaccharides. And that polysaccharides is now broken down into starch and fiber. And that fiber is then broken down to soluble and insoluble fiber. So examples of starch, which is part of the complex polysaccharides, would be potatoes, wheat, rice, barley. Now let's break down the fiber into the soluble and insoluble fiber. I know you've heard me said in other videos what soluble means, but basically it means to dissolve in water. So these carbohydrates, they dissolve in water or they form some kind of like gel or gelatinous substance. And examples of that would be oats, barley, beans, apple, citrus fruits, carrot, seaweeds. Those are all examples of soluble fiber. And insoluble means basically it does not dissolve in water. So insoluble fiber, which is part of the polysaccharide section of carbohydrates, it improves the digestion, bowel health, pulls toxins from the body. It is made from examples such as cellulose, and we can see it in fibrous veggies, whole grain, examples like asparagus, celery, wheat bran. These are all examples of insoluble fiber, part of the polysaccharide section of carbohydrates. Now, let's talk about resistant starch. Why do we need to know about resistant starch? Well, it controls blood sugar, it lowers blood cholesterol and triglycerides, it improves insulin sensitivity, and it increases satiety, meaning it makes us feel fuller longer. It also reduces the fat storage. Examples can be seen in brown rice, beans, potatoes, split peas. These are all examples of resistant starch. Now let's talk about refined versus whole carbohydrates, or whole grain. A whole grain, when we speak about whole grain versus refined grain, whole grain means that it has similar properties to what its original state would be. So whole grain usually comes from seeds of grass, and it has an intact, ground, cracked, or flake fruit. So the intact portion has to have the endosperm, the germ, and the bran. It needs to be similar to the intact grain in order for us to say it is a whole grain. Most whole grains properties include complex carbohydrate, fiber, protein, vitamins, minerals. It does not have cholesterol. It's low in fat. So they have all the nutrients except for vitamin A, vitamin C, vitamin B12, and vitamin D. And the properties of whole grain: reduces cholesterol, reduces blood sugar, reduces chronic diseases such as diabetes, heart disease, colon cancer. Now, let's get into the refined grain. Refined grain is basically that whole grain has been processed to the point where all the nutrients are stripped. So all the vitamins, the minerals, the fibers, they're all stripped from that grain. It's no longer the intact grain, so it does not have the endosperm, the germ, and the bran, but it's been processed to the point where all those good nutrients are now out of that grain. And that increases weight, and it also increases illnesses and disease. So we've heard about this whole glycemic index, glycemic load. What is that exactly? And how is it relating to carbs? Well, glycemic index basically is a measure or a measurement that is between 0 and 100 that ranks carbohydrates based on how quick they change into sugar after we eat it in the bloodstream. So anything that's greater than 70 is considered high. So white bread, watermelon, baked potatoes, popcorn, these are all substances that have a high glycemic index. But this glycemic index needs to also be considered with when you're eating carbohydrates. You're mixing it with, you're not just eating straight, or maybe you are, but most of the times you have to also consider this with what other stuff that person is eating to put it into context. And the glycemic load, what is the glycemic load? Basically, what is the actual intake of that carbohydrate that you're doing? How much you're doing? And that glycemic load is affected by other things too. It's affected by the body weight. It's affected by the quality of food. It's affected by exercise. So the most important concept that I want you to take away from this carbohydrate section of the nutritional series is that the source of carbohydrate matters the most. Whole grain food does not equate to refined grain. Especially when now you know that the refined grain has stripped nutrients. It does not have the vitamins, minerals, fiber that you'd find in the whole intact grain. And that refined grain tends to increase weight and increase disease conditions. It's also important to remember resistant starch. Resistant starch helps us to control blood sugar, lower blood cholesterol and triglyceride, and it improves insulin sensitivity. It increases our satiety, meaning we're fuller longer, and reduces fat storage. It's also important to recap that the polysaccharide carbohydrates has the starch and the fiber, and fiber is broken down into water soluble, not water soluble, or insoluble. And those insoluble fibers improves our digestion, our bowel health, remove toxins from the body. And you can find that in whole grain, which has the intact fruit, basically. So, coming back, carbohydrates. Let's always remember that the source of carbohydrates matters the most. So this is Dr. Warden from Hopkins Family Med and Urgent Care, and I just want to thank you for watching our nutrition series. This portion was on carbohydrates, but you can check out our other series on other aspects of nutrition. Thank you and have a blessed day.